All businesses need cash flow, but in a property business, you are in the unique position to be able to create cash flow, capital appreciation, and chunks of money. In this video, we're going to explore the opportunities that are open to you as you build and plan your property business. Every business needs cash flow. You need to be able to pay for the day-to-day expenses, whether that be establishment costs like heat, light and power, internet access, whether that be running your vehicles, whether that's vans or cars or whatever mode of transport you need, paying for different business expenses, subscriptions to programs that you're enrolled in. Having to pay yourself. So many businesses I see set up and they forget that they need to pay themselves. After all, if you don't have enough to live on month to month, how can you sustain the business? And if you're constantly worrying about being paid, then it makes it much more difficult for you to operate the business. Yet in the property business, one of the biggest mistakes I see people making is trying to run their entire business on cash flow. In other words, they use a strategy that produces very little cash flow. This has the effect of, first of all, probably not allowing them to move or transition into their business full time early enough to be able to really get the business moving. So they spend years with minimal cash flow trying to operate the business while working perhaps for another employer, and that becomes very difficult and frustrating for the business. So you need to be able to create large amounts of cash flow, but in addition to that, in order to really propel your business, you need to be able to create chunks of money, and also you need capital appreciation. In other words, you need your assets to be able to grow. So in the next segment, we're going to talk about capital appreciation. So while a lot of property businesses use cash flow in order to build their business, they also rely on capital appreciation. Now, capital appreciation is great when it comes, but often the strategies that people use for capital appreciation is just when the market is rising. Now, depending on which part of the country that you're in within the 18-year cycle, that may not be a very long period of time, particularly if you're like in the northern counties of England or in Scotland, perhaps parts of Wales. You might only see that capital appreciation in the second half of the property cycle. In other words, that 7-year period when things really start to move ahead. And of course, the last 2 years of that period is a dangerous period when the property market may be about to crash. So you have really a very, very limited period of time, 5 years potentially out of 18 years in order to achieve capital appreciation. But there are other ways in which you can achieve capital appreciation. And later on in this video, we'll talk about those. What you need is the goose that lays the golden egg. And in property, we call that creating chunks of money. You need to be able to create chunks of money so that you're then able to further invest that in properties that will create cash flow. So we'll talk about cash flowing properties in terms of residential and commercial properties, but we'll also talk about where you create chunks of money so that you are able to finance that purchases and lower that risk, as we've talked in the previous video series, about how you actually lower your risk by creating those chunks of money. So the chunks of money is vitally important, and it's one area that I find so many property investors and developers miss out on in terms of building their business. They maybe do create chunks of money, but they create chunks of money, I often find, in the wrong places. In other words, there's an 80-20 rule in everything, but particularly in property. If you spend 20% of your time in the right areas and the right strategies, then you can create significantly more money than if you're wasting time on strategies that produce very little reward. So let's go through the next sections where we talk about how you create cash flow and also how you create chunks of money. The strategy most people use and is taught by most people is to use residential property to create cash flow. Now, this used to be a very viable proposition because you could acquire properties, there was little if any, restrictions in what you were able to do with those properties, and in terms of the cash flow, that was kind of restricted. I'm not particularly keen on it because now it's becoming increasingly difficult. We saw in 2015 the introduction, or at least the proposed introduction, of new regulations, tax regimes. I won't go into the details of that. You're probably familiar with them if you are already in property, and they have made it difficult. And increasingly it's becoming more and more complex with the talk of rent controls being introduced, further legislation, the difficulty of being able to evict tenants from your properties, particularly even if they're not paying their rent. And so it's becoming a very, very difficult model, and really threatens your cash flow, I suppose, is the main thing. I remember, obviously, when I first got into property in 1973, that we actually had a lot of those restrictions, and that's why there was no real property investor market in that particular period of time. You had heritable tenancy agreements where they could actually pass on the tenancy to future generations, and so you were locked in with a tenant for years and years and years. There were also rent tribunals, so where they could actually set the amount of rent, and it usually was significantly lower than what you would certainly consider market rent, but actually wasn't even sustainable. So it wouldn't sustain essentially having a mortgage. So if you had properties in those days, you might have a mortgage, but there was no actual residential buy-to-let type mortgages. What you needed was actual cash, really, because if you had a mortgage, then you were actually infringing the regulations and the laws of the building societies who actually lent you that money. So very difficult market, and I see us, as history does, tends to repeat itself, moving back increasingly towards those times. So residential is a source of cash flow, but I think it's a threatened area of cash flow. And so the next area I want to talk about is commercial cash flow, because I think that's a much more sustainable place to be putting your investments when you're investing in property. Residential property, I believe, is a much more sustainable type of cash flow. First of all, you don't tend to have the interference of the various regulations. The theory is that businesses should be able to look after themselves, and that the consumer, in other words, in residential property, the consumer needs to be protected. You've only got to look at it currently with what's happening within the energy industry. So within the consumer market, you're seeing that prices are protected by the price cap, the energy price cap. And a lot of people sort of like saying, well, prices are going up. I have to tell you, in the commercial sector, that prices have gone up significantly. In other words, there is no price cap. I saw electricity prices go up for my office premises by 1/3. They jumped 1/3 in one shot. And of course, I expect they will go up again as more energy increases come down the road. So businesses are not protected in the same way. However, they also don't have the same amount of regulation that commercial properties do. In addition to that, you can have, depending on what type of commercial property you have, it could be a facility like this, which is multi-let rental offices, in which case we're able to rent out to various people, smart businesses, and significantly the income from there is much more sustainable. You can have full insuring type of leases, in other words, repairing and insuring leases, where they take all the burdens of expenditure and that becomes on the tenant, whereas in a residential property you are burdened with that as the landlord. So it's less restrictive, and the cash flow generated if you buy the properties in the right way and we'll talk about that a little bit further on, because we're going to talk about how you create chunks of money in commercial property. But if you buy them in the right way, then you can have much greater yields. So typically within the residential market, you'd be maybe looking at a yield of somewhere between 5 and 10%. Sometimes you can get a bit more than that, but you're rarely going to get anything above 15%. Whereas in the commercial market, you can get 25%, 20 to 25% is the normal range, and you can get significantly more. Now, you might have heard also that in the commercial sector, they tend to only get about 8%. That's one type of commercial, and that's investors who are very much hands-off. If you're a hands-on investor, then the higher yields are very, very much possible. And so now let's talk about how you create chunks of money. So creating chunks of money in the commercial sector is often buying properties at the right price. In other words, commercial properties that you are probably going to put in your portfolio to create cash flowing properties. And so the important thing here is to be able to buy them at the right price. And so this requires a little bit of creativity and a bit of imagination to looking at something as it exists and saying, how can I repurpose that building? Because often the best opportunities within the commercial property is where the current use or current disuse, as it's often the case, because that is no longer a viable proposition the way it is purposed at the moment, and saying, how can I repurpose that and make it a much more viable proposition? And so there are many instances where people have successfully been able to do that, take old factories and convert them or warehousing into self-storage, which can produce significant amount of money, costs very little in terms of labor to service, because you can have somebody on site managing the process for you. You just need good security, people coming in and out, and people are paying you on a month to month, and you can automate the process for that in terms of just the income coming in for short-term and long-term lets. In terms of space, as I say, very simple process to set up and to manage, but it has a very, very good yield. Serviced office accommodation, you can take shops that are no longer viable, turn them into offices, maybe into hot desk opportunities. There's various areas in commercial property where buying at the right price is crucial. It creates an asset value, and that asset value then allows you to buy further assets. So we're going to talk more about how you create opportunities within the commercial space in future videos. So that's on commercial. Now we're going to move on to residential, creating chunks of money. Creating chunks of money in the residential market is property development, essentially. In other words, you've acquired a piece of land and you are looking to build a structure on there. That could be single family houses, it could be a block of flats, it could be for other things like student accommodations, something that you might sell on. Of course, you could keep them in your portfolio as rental opportunities, but in terms of creating chunks of money, you would be looking to build those structures and then be able to sell them. So they would be, again, residential homes, flats, or commercial opportunities for other people, such as service accommodation. It could be service accommodation block, it could be student accommodation. So those then would allow you to do that. What you'd be typically looking to make is a 25% gross development value being essentially the selling price. In other words, what would everything on that site sell for? What's the gross proceeds from that? And from that, you would then take 25%, and that would be your expected profit margin. So if you've got a development that is going to produce, let's say, £1 million, then you'd be looking to make £250,000. In other words, £250,000. Now, with a £250,000 cash chunk, of course, you'd have to pay tax on that. You can then use that to further your cash flowing properties. So you can begin to see why it's really important to create chunks of money. The granddaddy of them all in terms of creating chunks of cash is from land development. There's several ways that you can do land development. One is you can acquire land. In other words, you find off-market land and you're then able to gain planning on it and capture an increase in value. The second way that you can do this is that you can work with the existing landowner where you never actually own the land, but you manage the process for them and uplift the value, and you share in the profit of that uplift in value after taking out your own expenditures. So the ability to use land as ways of creating chunks of money is very significant, because the beauty of this is that you are not restricted by the amount of cash that you have to enable you to do that. So land development, the sky is really the limit, and it's down to your imagination how much you can actually create out of that. But finding off-market land is absolutely key. So I hope you found that useful. The next few videos in this series is that we're going to delve in a little bit more deeply in terms of how you create cash flow both in residential and commercial properties, and how you create chunks of money both in commercial and residential opportunities for creating chunks of money. If you're interested in pursuing land development or property development, then of course we do have a course called Find It that's available to you. If you've liked this video, please give us a like and share. If you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please subscribe. Make sure you don't miss out on this important series, plus lots of other videos that are going to be coming down the tracks this year. So please like and share, and please give us a subscribe, and I look forward to speaking to you on the next video.